record. Yeah, welcome to the 24th segment of Old Testament Survey. We are well into the book of Judges. Last time I did an introduction to this anarchic Judges period. And we got started on the first couple of judges. The most interesting is Ehud, the left-handed son of the right hand, who assassinated a very fat Moabite by the name of Eglon, in a story that is striking, I think, for its humor. As we get into chapter 4 and 5, we get to the next major judge, which is Deborah. Deborah is going to work with an Israelite man by the name of Barak. Barak does the military part, but Deborah operates as the brains behind the operations. She's the intermediary with God. She operates as a prophet sort of judge. Deborah is a fascinating character, at least partially because there's so much we don't understand about her. Her bit in chapter 4 is enigmatic. We're not told a lot about her. Chapter 5 is the so-called Song of Deborah, and this is a bit of poetry that is, again, very, very old. It dates to, obviously, the time of Deborah, around 1300 or so, maybe as late as 1250 BC. Deborah comes in at about the same time as Shamgar, because she mentions Shamgar in this poetry. The poetry is all by itself difficult, ambiguous, lots and lots of unique language that we don't find anywhere else in the ancient world. So Deborah is this fascinating character who is surrounded by all kinds of questions. What we can say about Deborah is that she is an illustration, and her story is an illustration of the fact that women, particularly, who are entirely given to God, are capable of remarkable acts. The idea that women are second class, or women are somehow not worthy of a leading role in the people of God is not supported by the biblical data. The male leadership in both Israel and the church are clearly taught all over the Bible. We see that both Old Testament and New Testament, and in the history of the church. But that doesn't mean that the woman's role is either insignificant or unimportant. And very often we see the force of the women in Scripture driving the narrative. And Deborah's story is one of those instances. And really, there's a secondary character here. Deborah is the famous one, but really we don't know much about her. We get a secondary character who is a Midianite woman by the name of Jael, who is mentioned only here in the whole Old Testament, but who does a rather remarkable thing. And again, the humor of the episode, a kind of a dark humor, is very apparent. So let's go over to the whiteboard, or to the PowerPoint, see if I can make that work. Okay, presenter view, and we'll talk about see if I can make all of this go away. Oh, hey, I like this. I just discovered that I can keep my chat room open. Ooh, I didn't know that before. And I can even make it big enough. Ooh, this is really nice. I can make it big enough that if any of you ask questions, I may be able to spot that during my lecture. So the chat room is in fact open. Ooh, what fun. So here we are in chapters 4 and 5. We call this the servitude to the Canaanites. The Canaanites, you'll recall, back around 1400 BC, were defeated by Joshua. And so we might be tempted to ask, well, what are the Canaanites doing here and now? What Canaanites are these, and why are they still a problem? And I thought Joshua killed them all. Well, he didn't kill them all. He was supposed to drive them out, make them want to go elsewhere. But many of them stayed. The Canaanite civilians stayed, and as a matter of fact, many of the elites and the military were reconstituted fairly quickly. And we have a northern Canaanite coalition still led by the king of Hatzor. You'll remember that Joshua burned the city of Hatzor. The archaeological data demonstrates that Hatzor was rebuilt on the same site, bigger and better than ever, with a great big wall and a gigantic chariot army. Hatzor is a very, very prosperous location right on the trade route. I'm going to make my pointer into a laser, and I'll show you what we're looking at. This is an aerial shot. I didn't take this picture. I wish I had. But this is the northern part of Israel, the Jezreel Valley. All of this low country that you see is various components of the famous Jezreel Valley. This ridge line in the foreground is the land of Zebulun. The land of Issachar is over here. This mountain in the middle of everything looks like the hubcap off a 1939 Chevy. This is Mount Tabor, or Tavor. Mount Tabor is famous in New Testament studies as being the traditional location of Christ's transfiguration. That event didn't happen there. It had to have happened about 40 miles north of here. Nevertheless, Mount Tabor is interesting and important because the great international trade route runs past Mount Tabor. So if I'm crossing, north is to the left and south is to the right on this screen. And if you look way up here above the dot before servitude, you'll see the spot where the great international trade route comes down into the Jezreel Valley. And it runs through the valley past Endor. Endor is up on this ridge, goes between Endor and Mount Tabor, and then comes around Mount Tabor right about here and runs along the bottom of the valley all the way down to Megiddo, which is just a couple of kilometers off to the right-hand side of this photograph. Okay, so between Tabor and Megiddo here in the Jezreel Valley and in this low country here in the foreground is where this battle takes place. What makes this area interesting is the swampy ground. The river that runs through here are actually two rivers. Way in the background is a third river. There's a river way back here, that's the Jordan. Jordan is one part of the drainage, and part of the Jezreel Valley drains into the Jordan. The other larger part of the drainage here is called the Kishon. It actually has a name, and the Kishon drains the Jezreel Valley out into the Mediterranean Sea at Haifa. Unfortunately, the land just inland from Haifa is slightly elevated, so the river can't get through easily, so the water backs up. And all of the land inland from Haifa, most of the Jezreel Valley, is what we call sub-irrigated. That means the water table is very close to the surface, makes for excellent farmland, but very difficult land to drive a chariot through. For that reason, there's always, as long as anybody knows, been a road through the Jezreel Valley from north to south, also one going roughly east-west, the length of the Jezreel Valley, with an intersection at Megiddo. So this battle is going to take place in the Kishon River Valley, that part of the Jezreel Valley, at the foot of Megiddo, and not too far from the slopes of Mount Tabor. Okay, let me back up, and we'll do all of this. Let's introduce Deborah. Now we see in 4:1, chapter 4 of Judges and verse 1, the people of Israel again did the evil thing, went off to serve the Baals. After Ehud died, Ehud was the fellow with Eglon, and the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. We'll stop for just a moment on Jabin. Because you may have noticed, if you were reading Joshua, I didn't make a point of it, but the king of Hatzor in Joshua's day was also called Jabin. Is it the same king? Well, no, it's been 150 years, so it's not the same king. He's not called Jabin the second. He's just called, actually, he's called the Jabin. It is entirely possible that the word Jabin is not a name, but a title. And the king of Hatzor was simply called the Jabin, like the king of Egypt is called the Pharaoh, and the king of Russia was called the Tsar. A Jabin is a job title, perhaps. At any rate, Jabin, the king of Hatzor, was still the head of a bunch of northern kingdoms. And the commander of his army was a character named Sisera. Sisera is going to be more important here in a moment. And Sisera lived in a place called Hareshet Hagoyim, Hareshet of the nations. So this is one of the titles of the area around the Sea of Galilee, Galilee of the Gentiles, or Galilee of the nations. Hareshet is one of the locations in the lower Galilee valleys. So that's where Sisera is from. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. So here we see some details. 900 iron chariots. Maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot until you realize that in the ancient world, the chariot was a major high-tech, cutting-edge weapons system. Not just everybody could operate a chariot. The Egyptians, just a few years before, had their chariot army destroyed when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. Here we see a similar very large scale chariot army, 900 iron chariots. Now, please understand that these chariots were not solid iron. That would be far too heavy. Chariots were actually very lightweight. And iron would be used on the best of them in order to reinforce the weak places. So you think of a chariot as a kind of a wicker basket with a pair of wheels. The various parts of the chariot are actually very high tech and used very exotic materials. Some 22 different kinds of wood are used for the various parts of a chariot. There's a piece that runs right up the middle of the chariot, underneath the basket, and then necking upwards and across to go between the two horses. And that piece usually was made from a single piece of wood, a fairly tough wood, not necessarily the hardest wood available, but a very tough piece of wood. And it had to be specially grown so that it was pre-bent. That piece was placed between the horses, and another piece of wood was put across the chests of the horses for the harness. All of this is very complex, and it's all done by master craftsmen. Chariots weren't built in somebody's garage. They were built by craftsmen who knew exactly what they were doing and tested their work very carefully. Chariot wheels. By the time of the king of Hatzor, always had 6 spokes. They often had iron rims and then a wooden wheel with 6 spokes. They tried chariot wheels that were solid wood, like an ox cart. And those things worked nicely if you weren't trying to go fast. But if you wanted to go fast, you needed a lighter weight chariot wheel. So they began using spoked wheels. And we see early versions of chariot wheels with 8 spokes. And that worked very well. And so some of the designers, some of the engineers of the ancient world tried to make chariot wheels with 4 spokes, because if lightweight is good, lighter weight is better. Because in order to move fast, you have to be lightweight. And the horses can only run as fast as they can pull. So these things were tried, and 4 spokes turned out to be not strong enough. 6 spokes was just right. The horses have to be matched, and the taller, bigger, stronger horses were better than the little petite horses. We've got a horse here at our house who would not be very good at all pulling a chariot. She's much too small. Usually stallions were preferred for chariots. So great, big, strong stallions who could run really, really fast. And these were bred for strength and for speed and for endurance. And they had to be matched. So for one chariot, you've got a team of engineers and workmen who build and maintain the chariot itself. You have a team of grooms and breeders and helpers who are keeping track of the entire horse farm, so that there are always at least 2 horses who can pull the chariot. In addition to that, the chariot warrior and his driver are professional soldiers. In many parts of the ancient world, the chariot warrior is a nobleman called Marianu. And this chariot warrior would spend his full time training for battle. He would get together with others and they would practice their various moves and how to do this and how to do that, to get really good with the bow and arrow, to get very good with a sword or a javelin. Uh, at the same time, the driver was practicing with his teams of horses and making sure that the chariot would do what it was supposed to do. The driver and warrior team stayed together for an entire career. You didn't trade drivers or warriors unless somebody got hurt. So this is all a very complex thing. Uh, uh, you've probably heard the old line that's supposed to be from Africa, that it takes a village to raise a child. In the ancient world, it took a village to raise a chariot. The whole village would be dedicated to the support and the training and the raising and the production of the chariot. To field 900 chariots is an absolutely major national effort. Uh, you just don't whistle up 900 chariots. It's on the order of what the United States can do with an aircraft carrier. When the say the Eisenhower aircraft carrier battle group goes out on patrol, there are some 60 ships. There are a total of 80 aircraft, 80 to 100 aircraft on the carrier itself, with all the pilots and all of the Navy people and all the Marines and all of the workmen making all of the support happen. And all of that is backed up by shipyards and Navy bases and training facilities and simulators, universities, and all the rest of it, all the way back to the United States. It's a major effort to put an aircraft carrier battle group into position. And small countries don't do that. They can't do that. To put a 900 chariot army into battle was a major undertaking. And the author of Judges just says this was a real bad guy because he had 900 chariots. And he oppressed the people of Israel for 20 years. And it doesn't sound like a long time, but that actually is a long time. That's a whole generation. The people of the northern part of Israel, probably Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, maybe Naphtali and Asher as well, although we don't know, have this problem. So we're introduced then in verse 4 to Deborah. Deborah is called a prophetess, which means she has a pipeline to God. God speaks through Deborah. A prophetess, the wife of Lapidot. Lapidot is never mentioned except in this verse. His whole claim to fame in the Bible is that he was the husband of Deborah. Deborah is the prophetess. She is the one who is judging Israel at this time, and her position was between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. So Deborah is farther south of the location of the battle here, and she apparently had a ministry of helping to solve problems in the central hill country of Israel. Again, we don't know what she did, but she was very well known and very well respected. And the people of Israel came to her for judgment, and she sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, "Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? Go, gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon with his chariots and troops, and I will give him into your hand. So Deborah is really laying out the entire strategic situation and suggesting specifically what Barak ought to do at the command of God. Deborah is acting as an authoritative prophet in this situation. And it's interesting that the Lord here is not only commanding but promising. So Barak's orders here are in the form of a call to ministry. Here's a command with a promise. I'm commanding you to do these things, and I promise that it's going to work well. So Barak responded, if you'll go with me, then I'll go. Which is a very strange answer because, frankly, most soldiers would just as soon not have any ladies along for the ride. Ancient Near Eastern warfare was a grim and brutal thing. It was a bloody affair. The last thing you want to worry about is a lady prophet along for the ride. Women can handle all of this, but most men don't think so. And most men are chivalrous enough to want to spare their women folk the death and destruction and all of the rest of it. It's just the way it is. But Barak doesn't say that. He says, I'm not going to go unless you go with me. You're going to have to come along with me. And Deborah makes it clear that she's willing to go along. But this road that you're on will not lead to glory. The Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Because you've chosen to do this, Barak, because you've chosen to ask me along on this, as though you needed my help, the Lord is not going to give you any glory for this battle. Well, along it goes. Now, we're told in verse 11, which is fascinating, that Heber the Kenite had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zaananim, which is near Kadesh. Okay, now that's a foreshadowing. In literary terms, we're giving a piece of information now that's going to come in handy several paragraphs farther down. And so the story goes on. And Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, and Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the men who were with him. And Deborah said to Barak, rise, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And you can visualize this about where the N is in Canaanites. Barak comes down off the flanks of Mount Tabor, where he had been hiding in the woods with 10,000 men, and came running this way to come in behind the Canaanites, who were down in the low country close to the road. At this point, the chariots would have to spread out in order to do what they do. They're not very good working on a road. They have to get out into these fields. When they did, things went badly for him. And the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army to Harosheth Hagorim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. So quite a battle, quite an impressive, large battle. But Sisera, we're told in verse 17, fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hatzor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael came out to meet Sisera. Now, the story gets interesting. Now, we've already had this terrible battle. The battle is already won for all practical purposes. But here is Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, running away from the battle. And Sisera fled to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber. And Jael came out to meet Sisera and said, "Oh, my lord, turn aside for a bit. Do not be afraid." Okay? I visualize Jael as a little short lady. I don't see her as the tall, strong type. She's just a petite little girl. Okay? And oh, a soldier! Oh, how nice! Would you like to come in for just a moment? I could make you some warm milk. Would that be good? I have some bread cooking. Stay just a moment, couldn't you? And and so Barak turned aside and he said, "Well, I could use a little water. I'm thirsty." So she opens a skin of milk and gives him a drink, and then covered him up, and she covered him with a rug to make him nice and comfy. It tucks him in very nicely so he can get a little nap. There it is. Are you comfy now? Is everything good? Here, would you like some more of the milk before? Then you should sleep for a little bit. I'll be sure and let you know if anyone comes calling. And off she goes. And he said, "Stand at the opening to the tent. If anyone comes looking for you, you be sure and tell them that there's nobody here." But, and this is verse 21, but Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Now, this is difficult to do without visualization. When we modern people think of tent pegs, we think of a little aluminum thing about 20 centimeters long, that weighs a few grams, that you use for pegging your cute little nylon tent for camping. A tent peg in the ancient world was the size of your forearm. It was a large wooden peg, very sharp on one end because you're going to drive it into the ground, and with a mushroom shape on the other so that you can hit it with a hammer. The hammer would have been a thing that weighed several kilos. A big wooden mallet head with a long wooden handle. And Jael would have known exactly how to use a tent peg because her tent went up and down whenever it needed to. So this dainty little Jael goes out and gets a tent peg, and she picks it up and says, "Oh, this is a nice heavy one. I like this. Oh, it's so sharp. Oh, good. I think this will do." And she picked up the hammer, and she tiptoed inside and looked down at Sisera there. Isn't he adorable, sleeping like that? Well, may as well get on with it. And so she took this tent peg and laid it to the temple of his head, which is a place that she knew she could drive the peg through it. And she took the hammer and drove the tent peg, for heaven's sakes, through his head and into the ground underneath. And the Bible adds, I think, quite unnecessarily at the end of verse 21, and he died. And behold, and behold, the very next verse, 22, Again, this is all written very theatrically, and you see Barak finally showing up, and he's on his white horse, and he's got all of his finery. He's got his general stripes on, and he's got his sword drawn, and he's gallops up, and he's saying, "I understand that the enemy has come this direction. Can you tell me, dear lady, which way this fearsome character has gone?" And Jael comes out of the house. Dainty little Jael. Oh, another soldier. Oh, it's so nice. I'm glad you came. Could I get you some more milk? Oh, by the way, yes, I think the man you're looking for is already been here. And Barak saying, "Which way did he go? Which way did he go? I'll chase him away from." And Jael says, "Oh, dear me, I think you need to come inside. It's a bit of a mess, though. So uh, why don't you go in and have a look to see if this is the man you're looking for?" And there Barak found Sisera dead. And the whole thing is told with, I mean, it's a grim, gruesome event. The battle itself, thousands dead and wounded, bleeding all over the Jezreel Valley, and then the death of Sisera would be an absolutely horrible thing. In real life, anyone who did a thing like this would have nightmares the rest of her life. And yet the story is told with humor. God's attitude toward his enemies. It's a little difficult for us to handle in the modern world. And yet we see the story told here. So that day, 23, as of 423, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, the king of Canaan. So the battle went on, and we know archaeologically that the city of Hatzor was destroyed again around 1250 or so BC. This again is one of the destruction layers that is pointed out by the late date folks. But virtually everything in Israel was destroyed around 1250 BC, plus or minus 50 years. So there it was, and the defeat is chronicled. Chapter 5, the Song of Deborah, dates from this time. And it's good stuff. I'll just read you a little bit of it. The Song of Deborah is basically the song of an Israeli mother who decided to do something about crime in the streets. It's just a you get the picture of Deborah, a mother in Israel. Let me read from verse 6. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anak, in the days of Jael, and here's a name that everyone would know. In the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned and travelers kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord. So Deborah never claimed to be anything more than somebody's mom. And yet she spoke for God and led the people of Israel to a great victory. I like this story. I just like the story. Okay, enough of Song of Deborah. We'll go on to chapter 6, 6, 7, and 8 is the story of Gideon. It's one of the longer stories in this this whole section. Gideon is interesting on a lot of different layers. We're going to look at his defeat of the Midianites. Midian rhymes with Gideon, so it's fairly easy to remember. This picture is taken in Israel at a place called the Spring of Herod. The Spring of Herod is in the Jezreel Valley. Again, not very far from where Jabin's army was destroyed. Same general area. The Spring of Herod is the place where Gideon tested his soldiers to see who was ready for battle. And these two young men that you see in the water are not Gideon's soldiers. They're a couple of kids that I went with one year. And I asked them to pose like this for the illustration that I'm about to give you. So here we have the Midianites. Now, Midianites were an Ishmaelite people. They were a nomadic people group, and they had a tendency to ride their camels to war. And they would do this regularly. They sorely oppressed Israel. So chapter 6. Verse 1 starts out with the usual. So the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, there's the sin. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. And because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves dens in the mountains and caves in the strongholds. And whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. So all of the peoples of the east, the word Arab is used here. So the mixed groupings of people of the east that we've already talked about. Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites and Amalekites, Midianites, and all of the other peoples of the east, the desert people, stormed in out of the desert and stole whatever they wanted, all of their crops. They would encamp and devour as far as Gaza. They would leave nothing, no sustenance left over for Israel. Israel was brought very low, verse 6. So verse 7, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, here we have it, the supplication. So we get sin, subjugation, supplication. Next, we ought to get salvation, right? So the Lord sent a prophet. Well, this is new. And it's emblematic of the dynamic of the book of Judges. The story of Deborah was essentially a great victory. It was a good thing, but we see some underlying weakness. Deborah was the prophetess rather than a man. Usually male leadership is the norm. So there's that weakness. Barak was a weak leader. In spite of his victory, he was a weak leader. Still, the story of Deborah is generally positive. When we get to Gideon, things are less positive still. Earlier on, I said that there is a downward trajectory in the book of Judges. These adventures are less positive and more negative in each step along the storyline. So Gideon is not nearly as nice a guy, and the story shows a deterioration of the spiritual capacity of the people of Israel. So God sent a prophet, and he said, "Thus is the Lord, the God of Israel. I led you out of Egypt and brought you out of the house of slavery and delivered you. And I brought you into this good land. And I said, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites. But you have not obeyed my voice." Okay, well, that hasn't happened before. In the past, we've seen a supplication and then salvation happens right away. This time God sends a warning saying the reason you're having this problem, the reason you're having this problem for all these years is because of your sin, your continued sin, your lack of obedience to me over the very long term. Once God had delivered this message through his prophet, he sent an angel of the Lord to Gideon. Now, the angel of the Lord came and sat under the oak of Ophrah. Now, Ophrah is the name of a place in Israel. This is not a there's an American TV personality by the name of Ophrah. I don't think the name came from the city in Israel, but it's in that northern Israel in the Jezreel Valley. And the owner of the land was Joash the Abiezrite, and his son is a man named Gideon, who was trying to thresh wheat in a wine press. Now, a wine press is a little depression in the rock used for squashing grapes to make wine. Is not a good place to thresh wheat. Threshing wheat is something done by the whole village up on top of a mountain with everybody hollering and having a wonderful time and a big cloud of chaff blowing off into the distance. Threshing time is a wonderful time. And Gideon has a handful of wheat. He's beating on the wheat with a rock to try to break the wheat kernels loose from the stalk. It's a terrible way to thresh wheat. It doesn't work very well and may get Gideon enough for a loaf of bread. Nothing more than that. A terrible thing. And so there he is. He's hiding, essentially, because the Midianites will take everything. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him there and said, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And Gideon basically didn't know what to make of this. Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why is all this bad stuff going on? Why are all these bad things happening to good people if God is with us?" And the angel of the Lord continues. Let's see here. In verse 14, there's other things going on here. "Go in the might that you have, or go in this might of yours, and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Am I not sending you?" So the message is very much the same as the message to Moses. Take what you have, take who you are, what you have, and do with what you've got, and I will go with you. It doesn't matter who you are, Gideon. I will go with you, and you're going to save Israel. And Gideon says to him, "Please, Lord, how can I do that? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I'm the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites." And he said, "Well, how about you do a little miracle for me? I'll go get some food, and I'll be right back, and you do a miracle for me." "Okay," the angel of the Lord says, you go do your thing. So Gideon came back with some food, and the angel of the Lord held out his staff and caused fire from heaven to fall and burn up the offering. Zot Foof happens again, and this miracle is enough to get Gideon thinking that maybe it's going to be okay. So fire sprang up from the rock and consumed it. And Gideon says, "Alas," the Hebrew is "Oi, Lord God, now I've seen the angel of the Lord face to face." And the Lord said to him, "Peace be with you. Don't fear. You're not going to die." Gideon was afraid he was going to die. It's it's a little sad for someone that the angel calls mighty men of valor. he he just isn't. Well, anyway, that night the Lord said, "Take your father's bull. Hey, Gideon, take your father's bull." Uh, and the second bull. This is verse 25. The 7-year-old, pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord on top of the stronghold here, with stones laid in due order. And then take the second bull and offer it as a burnt offering, and of the wood of the Asherah that you shall cut down. So Gideon and his men, he had some friends who could go along with this, did all of this work. The name Gideon was probably given to him after this time. Gideon in Hebrew means chopper or hacker. And so his hacking down of the Asherah pole would have been remembered in his name. He pulled down the altar, he chopped down the Asherah pole, which would have been the major center of worship for the whole village of Ophrah. And sacrificed his dad's number 2 bull, a very expensive bull. And it's his dad's favorite bull. And there he is, sacrificed on this altar. And the next morning, people wake up, and alas, there's the altar of Baal broken down, the Asherah cut down, and the second bull offered on the altar. And they said, who has done this thing? And they asked some questions, and somebody snitched on Gideon. They said, Gideon has done this thing. Then the men of the town said to Joash, bring out your son that he may die, for he did this bad thing to Baal. And Joash said, will you contend for Baal? In other words, if Baal is really a god, he can fight for himself, can't he? And the men of the city said, well, okay, let's stand back and see what kind of bad thing happens to Gideon. And it turned out that nothing bad happened to Gideon. Well, later on, God continues, the angel of the Lord continues to say, you need to get on with this. And Gideon said, well, if you're really going to do this thing, if you're really going to save Israel, I need another sign. Let's have a fleece of wool. This is Gideon's famous fleece. And we're going to do it 2 ways. The first time, Gideon says, let's have a fleece, and we'll lay it out overnight on the ground, and the ground be dry, but the fleece be soaking wet. We'll wring water out of the fleece. And God says, okay, we can do that. Next morning, they're wringing out this fleece of wool. And Gideon says, I don't want you to be upset with me, but could we try this again? Maybe that was a fluke, and so we'll do it again the other way. This time, dew on the ground everywhere, soaking wet all over the ground, all the brush wet, and the fleece be dry. And God says, not a problem, we'll do it that way. And again, the miracle was done. By the way, this is a demonstration of Gideon's lack of faith. Faith is a trusting response to the words of God. We should never require a miracle to trust God. Gideon needed this additional bracing up because of the weakness of his faith. And God was willing to do that because Gideon needed it. We go then into chapter 7 and Gideon's, the description of Gideon's victory. This is fun. It actually is. It's a little sad, but it's fun. So Gideon, who's also called Jerubbaal, and all the people with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod, which is where this is actually the spring of Harod. This is the outflow from the base of a cliff. In the background, you can see some wrought iron fencing. Let's see if I've got, yes, I've still got a laser pointer. there's that wrought iron fencing, and this back here on the upper right is a cave. And that's where the Spring of Herod runs out, and it runs through a park, the national park called the Herod National Recreation Area. People go wading in the water, and kids play in there's a great big little kids pool, very nice with a slide, that kind of thing. So people come for picnics. Very strange. I like to take groups there to tell the story of Gideon, but I've never taken kids there. I think it might be kind of fun. So the Lord said to Gideon, the people are too many for you. They're just too many. So therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. So we're told that 22,000 went home while 10,000 remained. It means a total of 32,000 people. The numbers are a little large, as we've mentioned before. The Old Testament numbers are notoriously large, too large for the time. When we get to the size of 1,000, we'll talk about that, I think, later on. But here, very large numbers of men. 22,000 decided, because they had some experience, that hand-to-hand combat with swords and javelins and whatnot was a scary business, and they had enough common sense to go home. They were willing to do this if it had to be done, but if they were offered the chance to go home, they went home. 10,000 remained. God says there's still too many men. So I want you to test them. Take them down to the water and test them for one of these two kinds of behavior. You're going to see some of the men who will get down next to the water to drink, and they'll dip water out of the spring with their hands, and with their eyes wide open, looking around, they'll drink from their hands. This is the way soldiers are supposed to drink. So these men, anybody who drinks this way, is a trained soldier who knows enough to keep his eyes open when the enemy is close by. The Midianites are less than a kilometer away at this time. They're also camped. 300 men are like the second boy, who sticks his whole head in the water, not the slightest bit concerned, not looking around. He doesn't have enough common sense to know that when the enemy is not far away, you should keep your eyes open. Those 300, God says, will be more than enough. We'll beat the Midianites with these. And the Lord said to Gideon, take the 300 men who lapped like a dog, and I will give the Midianites into your hands. He sent all the rest back to his tents, but retained 300. And that night, the Lord said, here's how it's going to work. And Gideon required yet another dream. Gideon went down to listen to the conversation in one of the Midianite tents before he would go on with it. So Gideon took his 600 men and he divided them into 3 companies. This is verse 16 of chapter 7. And he put trumpets into the hands of all of them. So 300 trumpets and 3 empty jars, or 300 jars, and 300 torches. So everybody's got a torch that he's got covered up with a jar. And how that works, I'm not entirely sure. They probably used oil. And each one has a trumpet. Now, the one thing that you'll notice that these men don't have is swords. I think there's a reason for that. I think the writer is making the point that these 300 men are not trained soldiers. Matter of fact, if you gave them swords, they'd probably hurt somebody with them. And that's the last thing Gideon needed. This is going to be a battle that is won entirely by the Spirit of God. and quite the battle it is. So Gideon says, "Watch me and do what I do." You, at each of these 300. Yeah, I've got my trumpet, a shiny new brass trumpet, and probably a ram's horn rather than, we think of trumpets and we think of some nice school grade trumpet, but it was probably a ram's horn, a noisemaker. So I've got my trumpet, and I've got my torch. I always wanted a torch, and I've got a nice, clean, shiny pot. I'm ready for battle. Nobody told them that they maybe would want a shield or a sword. So out they go. Gideon led them to surround the Midianite camp at a distance. On his signal, he began to blow the trumpet, and all of the 300 began to blow trumpets. The men then broke their pots so that the torches flamed up. This is the middle of the night. The Midianite sentry in the middle of the camp immediately saw 300 watchfires of the circling enemy camps. He heard 300 trumpets sounding the charge from 300 separate camps, and every camp would have between 300 and 600 soldiers. So he quickly did the math, multiplying 300 times 600, carrying the zeros and figuring out that he was in serious trouble here, began hollering that the Israelites are about to attack. There's enemies in the camp. His friends are getting up out of their tents. They're pulling their pants on, trying to find their swords, looking for where they put their spear, running out into the darkness. Somebody let some camels loose. They're going one direction. You've got soldiers going another direction. Somebody gets run over by a camel, starts hollering in pain. The guards are saying, the Israelites are in the camp, and the whole thing turns into a panic. Total panic as Midianites are running out of the camp. They find their way back toward the Jordan River and begin heading south, with camels going everywhere and military equipment being thrown in every direction. Gideon, meanwhile, gathers soldiers from Manasseh and from Zebulun. They begin to chase the Midianites. Along the way, the men of Ephraim are finally invited to the party. And we see lots and lots of fighting going on all the way into chapter 8. The kings of the Midianites, Zebah and Zalmunna, finally are defeated. Gideon's story ends in a rather inauspicious way. It's not a nice ending to Gideon's story. Gideon's story is kind of fun because he wins the battle with a brass band and a torchlight parade. It's just fun. But afterwards, Gideon turns out to be not a strong leader. The people wanted him to be king, and he wouldn't do that. But he did take at least some of the jewelry, quite a large amount of gold that the Midianites carried, and turned it into an ephod. An ephod is a kind of idol. Later on, the people say, "You've got to be our king. We want you to be our king." And Gideon says, "Oh, far be it from me that I should rule over you. Only God can be your king." But he named his son Abimelech. The name Abimelech means, "My father is the king." And Gideon had multiple wives, multiple children by these multiple wives. He raised up an idol for Israel, and Abimelech turns out to be a really bad guy. The end of 8 and into chapter 9 is this sad story. It takes place in Shechem. This is Shechem between Ebal and Gerizim. Gerizim is the mountain in the foreground. Ebal is in the background. The ancient site of Shechem let's see if I can find it anymore. I don't think I can find it anymore. I think the ancient site of Shechem is right here. That is Jacob's well, right in that area. But there's an even older tell called Tel Balata that I don't think is in this this photograph. It's farther down the road. But this is the spot where Abimelech's story is going to happen. Abimelech tries to usurp the rule, and it's a relatively ugly story. Not much fun at all. He was made king at Shechem for a while. One of the survivors of Gideon's family is a youngster by the name of Jotham, who managed to survive the massacre by Abimelech. And Jotham tells a fable in chapter 9. It's a famous thing. We call it Jotham's fable just for this, about the thorn bush that became king over the forest. And the rebellion of Shechem against Abimelech and this terrible civil war. Finally, at the end of this thing, we're told that at the Tower of Shechem, a woman in her upper story dropped a millstone on the head of Abimelech. And the Bible again adds, I think unnecessarily, and he died. A millstone would be an oval-shaped piece of stone about half a meter long by about 12 or 13 centimeters in diameter. It was designed to be rolled across a larger stone by hand. So a woman would be able to pick this up, but it would be a heavy object. That would be 10 kilos anyway. And he dropped this from an upper story window, and it would be quite the weapon. And Abimelech died there. The beginning of chapter 10, we see this very brief note of the two more judges by the name of Tola and Jer. We're not told anything at all about them. Tola is a son of Pua, a son of somebody named Dodo. How would you like to be Dodo? They lived in Issachar. Jair lived in Gilead. They probably operated at about the same time as Gideon and Abimelech, all roughly the same time, but we're told virtually nothing about them. On Friday, we're going to pick up with Jephthah. We'll do Jephthah and Samson and close out the period of the judges on Friday. So as you can see, the Judges is storytelling. There's some fun stuff going on in the book of Judges. I'm getting everybody unmuted here if I can. Yeah, that should work. And the Judges is fun. It's some neat stuff going on, and yet at the same time, it's on a downward trajectory. Everything gets worse and worse as the years go on. It's the inevitable result of the people turning away from God. So there it is. We love you guys. Thank you for listening. We appreciate so much seeing everybody and hearing from you. I look forward to getting together with you again on Friday, and we'll finish up the Judges. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Dr. Jan. Bye, Donna.
See you now.
Good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You betcha. Bye-bye.